I walked into the small, dimly lit hospital room, my heart racing just a little. It wasn't my first time helping a patient, but there was something about the situation that felt different. As a nurse, I'd seen a lot, but nothing could prepare me for what was about to happen. Mr. Jacobs was a quiet man in his late 40s, and he usually kept to himself. He'd come in for some routine checks, and I was supposed to help him get ready for his next exam. The moment I stepped into the room, I noticed he was acting a little nervous, shifting on the bed like he was uncomfortable. "Everything okay, Mr. Jacobs?" I asked with a soft smile, trying to ease the tension. He nodded, but I could tell something was off. As I approached to help adjust his hospital gown, my eyes caught a glimpse of something underneath. His tool. It was clearly visible through the fabric, and for a moment, I froze. It wasn't something I expected to see, not like that. My face flushed red, but I quickly reminded myself to stay professional. I was a nurse, after all. These things happened. "Let's just get you situated for the doctor," I said, trying to ignore the awkwardness. But as I reached over to adjust his gown, he shifted again, and suddenly the fabric slid off completely, revealing everything. I gasped, not sure what to do. My mind raced as I tried to process the situation. Should I say something? Should I leave? Just then, the door creaked open, and another nurse poked her head inside. "Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt," she said quickly before backing out of the room. I couldn't believe how close she had come to seeing the same thing I had just seen. After she left, I turned back to Mr. Jacobs, feeling the tension growing even more intense. He looked embarrassed, but there was something else in his eyes, something that made me uneasy. "I'm really sorry about that," he said, his voice shaky. I tried to stay calm, but inside I was still rattled. "It's okay, let's just get you ready for your exam." But as I turned to grab some supplies, I felt his hand lightly brush against mine. I froze again. Was that an accident? Or was he trying to send me some kind of signal? Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any stranger, the door swung open again. This time, it was the doctor. He walked in, completely unaware of the awkwardness that had just unfolded. "Everything all right in here?" the doctor asked, glancing between the two of us. I nodded, quickly stepping back to let the doctor do his job. But even as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept thinking about the look in Mr. Jacobs' eyes, the way he had acted. Later that day, as I was going about my usual tasks, I received a message saying that Mr. Jacobs had requested me specifically for his next checkup. My stomach flipped. Why did he want me? Was it just because I had been there earlier? Or was there something else going on? The next day, I walked into his room again, trying to act normal. But the moment our eyes met, I could tell there was still tension hanging in the air. He smiled at me, but it wasn't the same nervous smile from before. It was almost confident. "I've been thinking about you," he said softly, and my heart skipped a beat. I tried to laugh it off, but my mind was racing. "Let's focus on getting you through your exam," I said, trying to steer the conversation back to something professional. But just as I reached over to adjust his IV, the door suddenly opened again. This time, it was Mr. Jacobs' wife. My heart stopped. She walked in, looked at me, then at him, and I could tell immediately that she sensed something was off. Her eyes narrowed and the room was filled with tension once again. I quickly excused myself, leaving the room before anything more could happen. But as I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As I carried on with my rounds, trying to focus on other patients, I kept thinking back to that moment in Mr. Jacobs' room. What was he trying to do? Was I imagining things? My thoughts swirled with confusion, and I couldn't concentrate. Hours passed, and just when I thought I had made it through the day, I received another message from the front desk. Mr. Jacobs had requested my help again. I sighed, bracing myself as I made my way to his room. This time, I was more determined to keep things strictly professional. When I walked in, he was sitting up in bed, waiting. There was a different energy in the room, something that made my skin tingle. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice low. I tried to keep my tone neutral. "Just doing my job, Mr. Jacobs." But he didn't seem fazed by my coldness. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, and for a brief moment, I thought he was going to say something inappropriate. My heart pounded, But then, out of nowhere, the door burst open. It was the doctor again, oblivious to the strange tension in the room. He looked over some paperwork, completely unaware of what had just almost happened. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as the doctor took over, giving me a chance to slip out of the room unnoticed. As I walked down the hallway, I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if the doctor hadn't come in when he did. Would I have let things go too far? Would Mr. Jacobs have pushed the boundaries even more? But as I continued my shift, something else began to nag at me. A strange feeling that this wasn't over yet. The way he had looked at me, the subtle touches, it felt like a game, one I wasn't sure I wanted to play. I finished my day and headed towards the exit, eager to leave the hospital and forget about the entire situation. But as I reached the door, there he was, Mr. Jacobs, standing near the exit, waiting for me. "I just wanted to talk," he said, stepping closer. I felt my pulse quicken, but before I could respond, I heard footsteps behind me. One of my colleagues appeared, calling my name. I glanced back at Mr. Jacobs, then quickly turned and walked away, leaving him standing there alone. For now, at least. As I hurried down the hallway, my heart pounded in my chest. I kept thinking about Mr. Jacobs and the unsettling way he had been acting. Part of me wanted to brush it off, but another part of me knew there was more to come. The next day, I tried to keep my focus on my other patients, avoiding Mr. Jacobs' room as much as possible. But around midday, just as I was taking a brief break, I received another message from the front desk. Mr. Jacobs was asking for me again. I hesitated before heading back to his room. This time, I wasn't just nervous, I was prepared to shut down any more inappropriate behavior. But as soon as I walked through the door, I could tell something was different. Mr. Jacobs was sitting up, staring at the window, his expression unreadable. The energy felt off, and for a second I thought maybe he was going to apologize for everything. Maybe I had misunderstood him. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, not looking at me. I stayed near the door, keeping my distance. "About what?" He turned slowly, his eyes locking with mine. "About what happened before. I think you know what I'm talking about." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "Mr. Jacobs, I'm just here to help you with your care." He smirked slightly, then leaned forward. "I think we both know it's more than that." Before I could say anything, the door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't the doctor, it was his wife. She stepped in, eyes immediately flicking between me and her husband. I could feel the tension grow even thicker, her gaze sharp as she took in the scene. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice tight. I quickly stepped back, my heart racing. "I was just leaving," I said, moving toward the door, but I could feel her eyes burning into my back as I exited the room. Out in the hallway, I tried to steady my breathing. What had just happened? Had Mr. Jacobs been trying to flirt with me again right in front of his wife? Or was there something even stranger going on? The rest of my shift was a blur. Every time I passed by his room, I could feel the weight of what had happened earlier hanging over me. But I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of Mr. Jacobs or his wife now. Then, just as I was about to clock out for the day, I saw her waiting for me by the front desk. "I need to talk to you," she said, her tone cold. My stomach dropped. "Is there a problem?" She gave me a hard look, then gestured for me to follow her down the hallway, away from the other staff. I reluctantly followed, feeling my nerves twist into knots. Once we were alone, she turned to face me, crossing her arms. "I know what you've been doing with my husband." I blinked, stunned. "What? No, that's not." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, cutting me off. "I've seen the way he looks at you, the way you act around him." I shook my head, trying to explain. "It's not what you think, I'm just his nurse." Her eyes narrowed. "I'm not stupid, he's been different ever since you started taking care of him, and I know it's because of you." I opened my mouth to protest again, but she didn't give me a chance. "If you think you can get between us, you're wrong," she said, her voice low and threatening. "Stay away from my husband." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there, speechless. I didn't know what to think. Mr. Jacobs had been the one acting strange, not me. But now his wife thought there was something going on between us, and she clearly wasn't going to let it go. The following days were tense. I avoided Mr. Jacobs as much as possible, but the situation weighed on me. I couldn't stop thinking about what his wife had said, or the strange way he had been acting. It was like I was caught in a game I didn't want to play. Then, one evening, just as I was about to leave the hospital, I saw Mr. Jacobs again. He was standing in the hallway, waiting for me. My heart sank as I realized I wouldn't be able to avoid him this time. "I need to talk to you," he said, stepping closer. I tried to stay calm. "Mr. Jacobs, I think it's best if we keep things professional." He ignored me, his eyes serious. "I know my wife talked to you." I nodded, feeling a knot of anxiety in my chest. "Yes, she did, and I think it's best if we both stay away from this situation." But instead of agreeing, he smiled, a slow, unsettling smile. "She doesn't know the half of it," he said quietly. Before I could respond, he reached out, grabbing my wrist. My heart pounded in my ears as I yanked my arm away. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping back. He smirked. "You're not going to tell anyone, are you?" "I think we both know how this will play out." I felt a surge of panic. "I'm going to report this," I said, turning to walk away. But as I reached the door, I stopped cold. There, standing just outside the room, was Mr. Jacobs' wife, her expression unreadable. Had she heard everything? The silence was suffocating, and I didn't know what to say or do next. My breath caught in my throat as I saw her standing there, just outside the door. Mr. Jacobs' wife, her face unreadable, had clearly been there long enough to overhear part of our conversation. My heart pounded, and I suddenly felt trapped between them. But instead of storming in or confronting us like I expected, she just stood there, her eyes flicking between me and her husband. A twisted part of me wondered, did she know? Did she suspect something more? The tension in the air was suffocating, and for a brief moment, I felt my own resolve falter. I hated to admit it, but there was something about Mr. Jacobs that had been lingering in my mind. The way he looked at me, the subtle touches, and even the size of his tool when I had first seen it. I tried to shake the thought from my head, reminding myself that this was wrong. So wrong. But my body had other ideas, and I couldn't deny that it had stirred something in me, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I turned back to Mr. Jacobs, who was still watching me with that same smirk, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. I should have walked away. I should have left the room right then, but something kept me there. The thrill of the forbidden, the danger, it was intoxicating, even if I didn't want to admit it to myself. His wife still hadn't moved, her eyes dark and calculating. I couldn't read her, and the uncertainty made my skin tingle. Did she know what was happening? Or was she just as in the dark as I was about what to do next? Mr. Jacobs took a step closer, his voice low. "She won't say anything. She knows better than to make a scene." My pulse quickened. There was something in his voice, something that made me want to push him away, but also pull him closer. His presence was overwhelming, and I hated how it made me feel, how my mind and body were at war with each other. "Mr. Jacobs, I can't do this." I whispered, more to convince myself than him. But then he leaned in, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. "You're already here," he murmured, his hand brushing against my waist, sending a shiver through me. I should have pulled away. I should have left. But instead, I froze, my body betraying me as his fingers grazed my skin. It was wrong. Everything about this was wrong, but there was a part of me that didn't want to stop it, that wanted to see where this dangerous game would lead. Just then, the door creaked open, breaking the moment. His wife stepped into the room, her expression icy but composed. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice too calm, too collected. I stepped back immediately, my heart racing. "Yes, I was just leaving," I stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. But as I glanced at her, I could see something in her eyes, a flicker of amusement, or maybe even approval. Did she know what had almost happened? Or worse, did she want it to happen? I grabbed my things and made a hasty exit, my mind spinning. As I walked down the corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just dodged a bullet, but also that I had left something unfinished. The encounter with Mr. Jacobs had left me more conflicted than ever, my thoughts consumed by him and what had almost happened. And despite everything, I couldn't deny that the idea still lingered in my mind. What was wrong with me? Why couldn't I just forget about him? But deep down, I knew the answer. The danger, the thrill, the forbidden, it was addicting. And now, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop. Het gaat om dit verhaal. Maak er een einde aan met een twist die niemand ziet aankomen. En maak het niet te lang. Maak er een einde aan met een twist die niemand ziet aankomen. En maak het niet te lang. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart racing. The encounter with Mr. Jacobs left me feeling confused and alive. But I also felt like I had escaped something dangerous. Just as I turned to leave, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around to find Mrs. Jacobs standing there, her expression intense. "Wait," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "We need to talk." Surprised, I nodded and followed her into a small, unused office at the end of the hall. She closed the door behind us, and I felt a wave of uncertainty wash over me. What did she want? "I've seen how he looks at you," she began, her voice low. "And I know what happened just now, but I'm not here to threaten you." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto mine. "I know what kind of man Tom is, and I can help you." "Help me?" I asked, bewildered. "I'm not the woman you think I am," she said, her tone serious. "Tom has a dark side. He manipulates everyone around him. I've been watching you, and I can tell he wants you for himself." Just then, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why would you help me?" "Because I want to expose him. I want to show you the truth. He's been lying to both of us." Before I could respond, she pulled out a folder from her bag and handed it to me. I opened it to find documents and photos of Mr. Jacobs, showing a side of him I never knew existed. "Look at what he really is," she urged, "and then decide if you want to be involved with him." Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The tension, the strange looks, the thrill, it was all a game to him, and I was just a pawn. But then Mrs. Jacobs smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "You see, it's not just about you or me, it's about power, and I'm not ready to lose mine." Before I could react, she reached into her bag again and pulled out a small object, a key. "Join me, and we can take him down together." In that moment, I realized I had walked into a trap, and the real game was just beginning.